Hello everybody, I'm Salim Kikeke. Welcome to Focus on Africa, our top stories. King Charles III makes his first visit to the UK Parliament since coming to the throne. In a special ceremony at the Palace of Westminster, he received condolences from both houses of Parliament. Also in the program, ready to talk. Leaders of Ethiopia's Tigray rebels say they are ready to participate in a peace talks under the supervision of the African Union. Thank you for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. With the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, there have been some truly historic moments over the past few days. And earlier today, there was another. King Charles addressed the Parliament for the first time as monarch in the 1,000-year-old Westminster Hall, the oldest part of the Houses of Parliament. He spoke to a rare joint session of both the Commons and the Lords and paid tribute to the Queen's dedicated service.
We gather today in remembrance of the remarkable span of the Queen's dedicated service to her nations and peoples. While very young, Her late Majesty pledged herself to serve her country and her people and to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation. This vow she kept with unsurpassed devotion. She set an example of selfless duty, which, with God's help and your counsels, I am resolved faithfully to follow.
The King then flew to Scotland's capital, Edinburgh, where, with other members of the family, he walked behind the state hearse bearing his mother's body as it travelled from the Palace of Holyrood House to St Giles Cathedral. The late Queen will lie at rest for 24 hours at the heart of the cathedral before her coffin is flown to London. The BBC's Alan Little is in Edinburgh.
This will be a reign finely attuned to the sensibilities of Scotland and the distinctiveness of its traditions and institutions. The King returned today to a Scotland that has been diverging from the rest of the UK politically for 40 years, and where support for independence is as high as it's ever been, particularly amongst the young. Nicola Sturgeon at Edinburgh Airport to greet him wants an independent Scotland to retain the monarchy, with King Charles and his heirs on the Scottish throne. As King, Charles will have to keep his views on that prospect to himself. The principle of constitutional monarchy chimes with public opinion, and there was no shortage of public affection for the new king as he progressed down the Royal Mile to his official residence, where the coffin of his late mother has been lying at rest. The King has chosen to begin his reign with visits to Edinburgh, Belfast and Cardiff is telling. It suggests that the future of the Union is at the heart of his concerns. The early decades of his late mother's reign were characterised by the long, slow contraction of British imperial power around the world. He will be alert to the possibility that his own reign could come to be defined by the continuation of that process here and the eventual dissolution of the United Kingdom itself. But all that is for another day. A bearer party of the Royal Regiment of Scotland brought the Queen's coffin from Holyrood House back into public view. For today, the eyes of the world intrude on private sorrow, as the Queen's family subordinate their own grief to the imperatives of public ritual. Queen Elizabeth's 4 children walked behind their mother's hearse. Briefly, an insult was shouted at the Duke of York.
Andrew, you're a settled man.
It brought this reaction from an otherwise subdued crowd. The Royal Mile of Edinburgh is an ancient thoroughfare, steep in its progress towards St Giles Cathedral. the historic High Kirk of Edinburgh, where the Queen had sometimes worshipped, not as head of the church here, but simply as a member. Here they placed on the coffin the crown of Scotland, made in the 16th century for the Queen's ancestor, James V. Consider the quiet symbolism of it. It is a gesture toward the distinctive character of Scotland's historic nationhood. The first lesson was read by the First Minister.
For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up.
The Queen's coffin will lie in rest here for 24 hours. Members of the public will be admitted to file past and pay their respects. Tomorrow it will be taken to London to lie in state at Westminster Great Hall for 4 days. In life, Queen Elizabeth was a powerful force for national cohesion. She came to embody a shared history and a common sense of identity. What will remain of that legacy when this period of mourning is over and she begins to recede into the middle distance of our collective memory? That question will be at the heart of the new reign that began when she died. Alan Little, BBC News, Edinburgh.
Now, during her reign, Queen Elizabeth visited 22 countries in Africa over 55 years. And it was on a visit to Kenya in 1952 with her husband, Prince Philip, that she heard the news of her father's passing, and that she was to become Queen of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of course the head of the Commonwealth. It was the start of a close and sometimes complicated relationship between the British monarchy and post-colonial Africa, as BBC Africa's Victoria Wonghunda reports.
The gay finale to 11 days of royal happiness.
In step with a changing continent, Queen Elizabeth II and Kwame Nkrumah, one of the figureheads of the independence movement in Africa. Some saw the Queen's dance with the Ghanaian president as an attempt at warmth in the Cold War battleground emerging on the continent. Africa's newly independent countries were being heavily courted by the Soviet Union, and the UK wanted to keep them on the side of the West. In 1957, Ghana became Britain's first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence. The British Empire was coming to an end, but for many countries, a special link to Britain endured through the Commonwealth of Nations. And no matter the separation of monarchy from politics, Queen Elizabeth was swept along by the winds of change blowing across the continent. Nigeria was one of the first countries in Africa that the Queen visited after her coronation.
My husband and I have been deeply touched by the welcome you have given us. We, in return, bring to you the affection and the support of my other people in the United Kingdom, whose eyes are turned on Nigeria today.
The Queen's devotion to the Commonwealth was clear, but early optimism would be challenged over the following decades. In 1995, Nigeria, under Sani Abacha's military rule, was suspended from the Commonwealth over human rights abuses. It was readmitted 4 years later after a return to civilian rule, headed by President Olusegun Obasanjo. But no country showed the complexity of the relationship with the Commonwealth like Zimbabwe. President Robert Mugabe was a committed Anglophile, loving cricket, Savile row suits, and the royal family.
I pray that the process of positive change underway in South Africa may be successfully continued. Heads of government in Harare will certainly do their best, I'm sure, to give it every encouragement.
But over the decades, relations between the UK and Zimbabwe soured, particularly over Mr. Mugabe's land reform program. In 2003, Zimbabwe withdrew from the Commonwealth at the height of tensions. And a knighthood bestowed on President Mugabe in 1994 was annulled in 2008 by the British government. It was in neighbouring South Africa that the Queen was drawn closest to the risk of political involvement. In 1986, leaders of the Commonwealth nations came together to agree on a program of economic sanctions against South Africa's policy of racial segregation known as apartheid. 48 of the 49 nations all signed off on a plan. The only one holding out was Britain, whose government was then led by Margaret Thatcher. It was widely reported that the Queen disagreed with Mrs. Thatcher's position, seeing it as damaging to the Commonwealth. But perhaps the most enduring of images of the Queen's relationship with the continent was after apartheid had ended, meeting South Africa's first black president, Nelson Mandela. Their relationship was said to be close. She signed letters to him with "Your sincere friend Elizabeth R." and apparently referred to him as Nelson, and it's claimed he called her simply Elizabeth, a break with royal protocol, but perhaps one that only Nelson Mandela, the man who symbolized Africa's freedom from colonial rule, could make.
That report by Victoria Onhunda. Queen Elizabeth II is said to have had a special place in her heart for Africa. Still, the royal family's relationship with Africa is long and often complicated, intertwined with a history of British colonial rule in several African nations, one that left behind a legacy of segregation, economic ruin and disenfranchised citizens. Let's bring in Dr. Sishwa, who is in Cape Town. He is a lecturer in modern history at the University of Zambia. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. Dr. Sishwa, the Queen's body is lying at rest at St Giles Cathedral in Scotland. Right now, as we speak, we've seen mixed reactions to the news of the Queen's death from those on the continent. Why is the relationship between the Queen and Africa a somewhat complicated one?
Well, I think it's fair to start by acknowledging the fact that the reaction from the continent to the Queen's death has come with a surprise to the average British person. And that's hardly surprising given the passage of time and the Queen's old age. Most British people either don't associate her with the British Empire, they don't know much about the negative side of it, or if they do, they see it as belonging to a distant past. So overall, they tend to see her and themselves as innocent. But many Africans, see things differently. It's not to do with the Queen herself or the person, but rather with the institution of the British monarchy and the atrocities committed in its name. Here we see Africa's complex relationship with the monarchy and the Queen, one that recognizes her association with a problematic colonial legacy, but also as a global celebrity figure who has been used, one would say, to legitimate the UK's interest in former colonies and to build the country's soft global power. And that has had the effect of masking and I would say deflecting the brutal legacy and the atrocities of British colonialism.
Right, we'll talk about colonial legacy in a moment, but if we look back in the late 80s, there was a fallout with the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher on how to deal with apartheid regime in South Africa. Clearly, she had different views on how to handle South Africa, but she couldn't change the influence the PM had and the foreign policy then.
That's fair. I think it's also worth remembering that Queen Elizabeth herself was the last imperial monarchy and that her reign saw unprecedented decolonization in Africa. In her time, the empire forged through force became the Commonwealth, which is a voluntary organization that I think has enabled the UK to maintain global influence beyond the size of the nation. And she had good relations with a number of African nationalists like Nkrumah in Ghana, Kaunda, and as you said before, Mandela in South Africa. And I would say that even though we may be critical for her role in not acknowledging the brutalities of the British colonial past, the Queen Elizabeth herself can hardly take credit for the dismantling of empire, but she can also not be accused of building it. And in that sense, I think that she played a crucial role in forging this new relationship, except in Kenya, where the anti-colonial struggle was violently repressed by the British military.
Dr. Sishwa, I mean, over 60 years after many African countries gained independence from Britain, there are those who still argue that the British colonial rule, the colonial legacy you're talking about, affected development. Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment?
It is a fair assessment, but it's also one that should not be used to, provide excuses for the failure by post-colonial African leaders to provide services for the citizens. But I think it's also worth noting that across the continent, and especially among its young people, there are growing calls for an acknowledgement of that terrible past and for the return of the cultural artifacts that were looted in the interest of empire and in the name of British monarchs. So the problem, as I see it, is that fixating on Britain's royalty when it was successively elected governments that did so many vile things, risks making the monarchy a lightning rod and protect the British people from having to fully own their past. So it's a very complex relationship, but one that should not be used to provide excuse for the failure of African leaders.
Right, Dr. Sishwa in Cape Town there, lecturer in modern history at the University of Zambia. Many thanks. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much. Well, still to come, giving back and making amends. We hear from a former Liberian child soldier and his journey to redemption. Welcome back. I'm Salim Kikeke and this is Focus on Africa. Now, the African Union has welcomed an announcement by Tigrayan rebels that they are willing to take part in peace negotiations. The Tigrayan leadership said it was ready to participate in the process under the auspices of the AU. There has been no direct reaction from the Ethiopian government, but it has previously said it would talk anytime, anywhere. I'm joined now by William Davison, a senior analyst for Ethiopia from the Crisis Group. Thank you so much, William Davison. Is this a new position? Have we been here before with the Tigrayan rebels wanting to negotiate?
Well, they see themselves as the elected representatives of Tigray regional government. They've always said that they're committed to a negotiated settlement and peace, but of course that's on their terms. There are some new elements here. We see explicit backing for the African Union to lead the peace process, but they have also complained or opposed the African Union's envoy and mediator, President Obasanjo. So we're yet to see whether that opposition still holds. And also, previously, Tigray's government has said that the federal government must lift the siege as Tigray portrays it. They must lift the siege before any serious talks can occur. And at this stage, it's a bit early to tell whether that sort of demand has shifted at all.
Why are they uncomfortable with Olusegun Obasanjo?
The claim is that, essentially, is that he's too close to Addis Ababa. The African Union is headquartered in Addis Ababa, that he's partial, and his understanding of the conflict is that of the federal government, and he doesn't properly understand the Tigray cause and why they are fighting this armed resistance.
Do they have a preference as to who should be the mediator?
They haven't been completely explicit about that, but there's a general understanding they would like to see Kenya's government, probably former President Kenyatta, play a role. There has also been signs from the African Union, this is somewhat significant, that there could be an expanded mediation with the involvement of international actors like the US and the EU. The US has been a key facilitator, including of talks in recent days. And we should note that it is very good news that talks have occurred over the last couple of days, because fighting resumed after something like a 9-month pause. Fighting resumed just a couple of weeks ago.
Now, how can the African Union ensure that the negotiations actually take place?
The African Union and the other international partners face essentially the same obstacles. Unless the federal government is willing to meet some of these Tigray demands, so for example, to restore basic services in advance of formal negotiations, so telecoms, communications and banking, or unless Tigray's leadership is willing to attend negotiations whilst they still wait for the restoration of those services and other aspects of what they call a blockade, then it's going to be difficult to get talks moving. So the African Union, the US, the others, they need to encourage the parties to make those kinds of alterations in their positions.
William Davison, thank you so much. Thanks for that analysis. Senior analyst for Ethiopia from the Crisis Group. Many thanks. Now to the story of one man turning his life around and making amends for his past deeds. Maurice Matadi was only 11 years old when he was recruited as a child soldier in Liberia. A brutal civil war ravaged the country between 1989 and 2003. Close to 250,000 died. Tens of thousands were displaced and many more fled the country. The nation is still healing its wounds. Here's how Maurice is giving back to his country.
The bullet that I shot during the wartime.
The bullets that I shot during the wartime killed them. I cannot bring them back to life again. I cannot restore their life again. I am Maurice Matadi. I am a Liberian former child soldier that participated from the ages of 11 to 20.
Maurice was a child soldier for nearly a decade, until 2000.
I can remember that my dad asked me one day at the dinner table who I really wanted to be, and I said I wanted to become an Air Force pilot. But when the war came, things changed. All my dreams went down the river. I started a new life after my family was killed at God Bless You Gate, and I was recruited by the same rebels.
Liberia's civil war ended in 2003 after 2 bouts of the conflict. Thousands of child soldiers were recruited to fight.
I was given my first AK-47 and it was like, wow, I have received my mom and dad. I felt like I could use it to get food. I felt I could use it to protect myself and the people around me. I felt that I could use it to move forward with my life.
Maurice is now giving back to his community by educating children, including those of former child soldiers.
All former child soldiers have difficulty in bringing their kids up. Some are not fully rehabilitated. They're involved with crime and drugs, and because of their involvement, some are killed by mob violence. Presently, we're providing free education for 285 kids in Buchanan. I feel that I'm giving back to the society, although I did not willingly participate to destroy my own country. The bullets that I shot during the wartime killed them. I cannot bring them back to life again, or I cannot restore their life again, not rebuild those houses that my bullets or my grenade burnt down. But with my present attitude towards the community and what I'm doing, I believe I'm closing or I'm cementing those holes or concreting them so that the community can look at me differently.
Now, a reminder of today's top story. Members of the public in Edinburgh have had the first chance to view Queen Elizabeth's coffin and pay their respects ahead of her state funeral next Monday. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the late Queen as she was taken from the palace of Holyrood House up to the Mile to St Giles Cathedral for a service of thanksgiving honoring her life. King Charles III led the royal family in solemn procession behind his mother's coffin. And that's it from Focus on Africa. My name is Salim Kikeke. Bye-bye.